All right, you guys, if you take a bird's eye view of the answer choices, right, you know you're being tested on verbs, right? We have like fueled, to fuel, fueling, having fueled, right? Now, one of the most important things that you have to know about verbs in the SAT is that the SAT can test you on verbs in three different ways, okay? So the first way that they can test you on verbs is what is known as subject-verb agreement, right? So this is where you're gonna see, where you're gonna have like singular subjects like the boy, right? Pairing with singular verbs, right? The boy plays, right? You're not gonna, and you're also gonna have like plural subjects, right? Like the girls, right? Paired with plural verbs, right? The girls play, you know? So that concept is basically saying that singular subjects have to take on singular verbs, plural subjects take on plural verbs, right? Subject verb agreement. You're going to be able to tell that you're being tested on subject verb agreement because the answer choices, you're going to see like differences between like a singular verb and a plural verb, right? That's one obvious clue. Now, the second way that you can be tested on verbs is what you have here. This is called verb forms, right? Verb forms. So a verb form is just a fancy way of saying, right, like how the verb is written, right? So how that word is written, right? Now, the thing is, you guys, the form of the verb, in other words, the way that a verb is written can affect the structure of the sentence, right? So let me say that again, right? The way that a verb is formed can affect the structure of a sentence, right? So to give you guys a very simple example of this, if I say, um, the girl studying for the test, you would recognize that, right? The verb form, right? Studying, the ing form, you would recognize that as an incomplete sentence. But if I said the girl studied for the test, then you would recognize that as a complete sentence, right? So the form of the verb, right? The way that the verb is written can affect the structure of the sentence, okay? So typically, you guys, right? One of the key characteristics that can tell you that you're being tested on verb forms is you're gonna see like answer choices that have like to fueled, right? Like to, that infinitive form. You're gonna see another one with like ing, right? Like having fueled and fueling, right? Those are some common characteristics, right, that you're gonna be tested on verb forms. Now, here's the thing. The reason this is important is that when you're tested on verb forms, you're oftentimes gonna be tested on sentence structure as well, okay? Because like I just mentioned, right, the way that a verb is formed can affect the structure of the sentence, right? You can create sentence structure errors with different verb forms, right, or different ways that verbs are written, okay? Now, the third way that verbs can be tested is with verb tenses, right? So you have like the future tense, right? Like will, fuel. You have the past tense like fueled and the present tense, right? Like fuels. Okay, so those are the three main ways that the SAT can test you on verbs. Now, why is this important, or how do I want you guys to use this? Well, I want you guys to use this in this way. So so I taught you guys, right, in other videos, that before you start just reading the passage, right, I want you guys to take a bird's eye view of the answer choices. This is what I've been doing, right, starting out a lot of these videos, right? Taking a bird's eye view of the answer choices kind of lets you know what concept or question type you're going to be tested on. And that's extremely important because if you can recognize that you're being tested on verb forms in this question, well, that's going to affect the way that you read, right? So it gives you a lot of power knowing that, oh, the SAT is testing me on commas, for example. Oh, the SAT is testing me on verb forms. Oh, the SAT is testing me on subject verb agreement, right? And you don't have to know everything, all of the things that they're testing you on. But if you can identify one thing, you have a great starting point, okay? Because that'll help you guys to eliminate the incorrect answer choices a lot more confidence, right? Because you know what they're testing you on, right? You know that certain answer choices kind of violate, right, the rules based off of what you know the SAT is testing you on for this particular question. Okay, so with that being said, y'all, jumping into this question. So I'm just going to start off with the second sentence here, just for the sake of time, because it's underlined underlined portion, underlined blank, is part of the second sentence only. Okay, so it says many, but I don't recommend you guys doing this. I want you guys to read from the beginning, but in this part of the answer explanation, I'll just read from the second sentence. So it says many economists contend that this dot-com bubble was a quintessential example of speculative frenzy in which investors' fervor for technological innovation um, fueling valuations far beyond what the underlying business models could sustain. Okay, so guys, if you haven't seen my last video, the one that talked about dependent clauses, the components of a sentence, I would recommend watching that. It's going to be video number 17, or I'm sorry, question number 17 in the title. So I give you the answer. The question itself was pretty straightforward, but the underlying concept is extremely important. So I don't want to go over that. I don't want to go over the entire concept of dependent clauses again in this video. So it's extremely helpful that you watch the previous video to understand the concept of dependent clauses before you come back to this video, because that'll make this video make a lot more sense. Okay, so that's what I would recommend you guys do, is watch that previous video and learn about the fundamental concepts, the foundational knowledge for dependent clauses. I'll just briefly kind of talk about it here, okay? So one of the most important things that you're gonna have to do when you identify, to get really good at sentence structure, is you're gonna have to be able to do what I call tracking. You're gonna have to be able to track or identify when a component, like a dependent clause or an independent clause, right? But you have to be able to identify when this component appears in a sentence, right? So where it begins, and then you have to be able to follow it, right, to figure out where it ends. Okay, now it's very simple to figure out where it ends. If you just read it, you can tell. All of you guys can do this. I've done this with over 7,000 students. Every single one, right, have done this without fail. So each of you guys can do this if you just read it, right, and pay attention. That's it. But you guys can all tell when this type of information should end, right, just by reading it or following it, though. Okay. Now, this is going to be extremely important because your foundational knowledge of these components, right, is going to dictate whether or not the SAT creates these components in a grammatical way. So, in other words, one of the when the SAT is testing you on verb forms like this, they're also testing you on sentence structure. Right now, one of the so the way that the SAT can test you on sentence structure is by creating sentence structure errors, right? Like run-on sentences, fragments, right? If you don't know what those are and want to learn about them, drop them in the comment box. I can teach you guys those in a future video. But those are the two most common sentence structure errors that you're going to encounter on the SAT, right? But there's a third category of sentence structure errors, right? That's just basically when you have the sentence structured incorrectly. It could be structured incorrectly for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is that a dependent clause is not going to be properly formed. So one of those sentence structure errors is a DC that's not grammatically created, right, or formed. Okay, so this is where your knowledge of your foundational knowledge about dependent clauses that I talked about in the previous video is going to come in extremely handy. So one of the things that I stressed heavily in that previous video is that every single dependent clause must always have what inside of it? It must always have a verb inside of it, okay? Now, I'm not just talking about a word that looks like a verb. I'm talking about a word that actually functions or acts like a verb. Now, there's a difference, right? I gave you guys that example earlier. If I said the girl studying in the library, right? Well, studying is a verb form, but it doesn't function like a verb. Okay, now that's because there are some verb forms that don't act like verbs when they're by themselves. This is one of those. Okay, ing words, you guys, these ing words are created from verbs, right? So studying is created from the verb to study. Fueling is created from the verb to fuel, right? But by themselves, these guys are not actually verbs. Like they don't function as verbs. These guys are called participles, right? Like present participles. Again, if you don't know what those are, it's important to learn it. If you guys want more help with verbs, drop them in the comment box, right? But the thing that you have to know right now is that ing words by themselves look like verbs, but they don't act like verbs, okay? So that'll be extremely important. So like having fueled and fueling are not verbs. Okay. Now these types of words only become verbs when they get help from another verb. So oftentimes you'll see, right, like another verb that's paired, another word that's paired with these ing words, if it functions like a verb, right? So if I said now the girl is studying for the test, you'll be like, oh yeah, that's a complete sentence, right? The reason it's a complete sentence, you guys, is not because of the word studying. It's because of the word is, right? So is what makes this a verb. It's not the word studying, right? Because if I just had the word, if I just had the sentence or the statement, the girl studying for the test, you would know that's not a complete sentence, right? Because ing words by themselves, although they look like a verb, they don't act like a verb. They only become verbs when they get help from other verbs, right? These are called auxiliary verbs or helping verbs is all, okay? So that's important to know. Another thing, you guys, is these infinitive forms, right? To fuel. Also, right, it looks like a verb, right? It's created from a verb, right? To fuel, but it doesn't function like a verb, right? So just like ing words by themselves do not function like verbs, right? Infinitive verbs like to form also don't function or don't act like verbs, right? They just look like them is all, okay? So they only become verbs when they get help from another verb, right? So now if I said, I tried to fuel, right? Now this becomes a verb because of the verb tried, not because of the word to fuel, okay? You guys are starting to see it, right? You guys can see how verb forms can affect the structure of a sentence. Now let's bring this all back together, right? So I told you guys that dependent clauses, right? Dependent clauses must always have a verb inside of it. Not just a word that looks like a verb, but a verb that actually functions or acts like a verb, right? So now this is where it becomes important. Uh, when I notice this part of the sentence, in which, this is where tracking comes into play. I notice this is where a dependent clause begins. Again, if you guys just watch the previous video, you'll know that I mentioned that there's 3 different types of dependent clauses, right? This type of dependent clause is a relative clause. A relative clause, in this case, begins with the relative pronoun which, right? And the job of a relative clause is going to be to modify or describe the noun that came before it. So in which investors' fervor for technological innovation fueled valuations, this is just describing the frenzy, right? It's modifying the speculative frenzy. That's the function, or that's how relative clauses or this type of dependent clause works, okay? But what's important here is that you identify where it begins. And it usually begins with the relative pronoun. In this case, it begins with the preposition, but like in which I notice, oh, this is a dependent clause, right? Now this is where tracking comes into play. So now just follow the relative clause to figure out where it ends, right? So now you say, in which investors' fervor for technological innovation, fueling valuations far beyond, right? Now, this is another type of dependent clause called a noun clause, right? Noun clauses can begin with the like a word like what, or it can also begin with like, who, what, where, when, why, right? Again, the previous video talks all about this. But this noun clause, this is a type of dependent clause, right? And so what the underlying business models could sustain, this is a separate dependent clause, right? It's just kind of combined with the other components in the sentence to create a more complete and clear sentence, right? But this is a dependent clause by itself, okay? What the underlying business models could sustain. Now, we mentioned that every single dependent clause must always have a verb inside of it, right? Well, the verb that's inside of this dependent clause, this noun clause, is could, right? Could sustain. Well, that's that verb. Let me ask you this other question. Well, where's the verb inside of this dependent clause, this in which dependent clause? You don't have one, right? When you plug in answer choice A, you don't have that verb, right? Because ing by itself is not a verb, right? It doesn't function like a verb. It looks like a verb, but it doesn't function like one, right? So we know that that's not going to be correct. And in fact, answer choices B and D are also not going to be correct for the exact same reason that these words are not verbs, right? They don't function like a verb. C is the only answer choice that's going to be grammatical in this case because, right, it creates a grammatically formed or grammatically um, formed dependent clause, right? This in which investors' fervor for technological innovation fueled valuations, right, far beyond. And then we have this other dependent clause here, okay? So it fueled innovation, it fueled valuations, right? So now we have an actual verb inside of it, right? So now this dependent clause is formed correctly because the verb, right? The verb form is actually a verb that actually functions like a verb. Okay, so this is how you know, you guys. So sentence structure can be tested in many ways. A lot of different ways that they can test you on sentence structure, right? The most common one is with punctuation marks for sure, like periods and semicolons and commas and colons and stuff. But they can also test you on sentence structure with verbs. You just saw it right here, right? So just be on the lookout for it. But again, this is why you guys, yeah, I think the most important thing to know about grammar is what I call the foundations or the building blocks of grammar. The building blocks of grammar is basically those 5 components of a sentence, right, that I talked about in the previous video. I'll create a new video for it, a separate video that really dives into the 5 different components. I could talk about these components for hours, but this is by far, I think, the most important thing to know. At least it's the most foundational thing to know, right? Because if you don't understand these components, right, um, you're going to have a hard time answering, sentence structure questions, grammar questions on the SAT. It's just going to happen. And you don't want your score to be determined by luck, right? Like you want to have control over your score. In order to have control over your score, you have to be able to master um, the building blocks of grammar, right? No questions asked. That is something that I teach to all of my students, regardless of what level they're in. If they're walking in to work with me and they already have a 1550, I still teach them this, right? Because it's that important. And I've noticed that every single student, not a single one was like, oh yeah, I'm super confident about that. Every single student always had some level of doubt, right? When it came to sentence structure, right? And punctuation. They just weren't sure, right? They were doing it based off of feeling as opposed to based off of facts, right? And I want to train you guys to master this stuff, not just like the art, or not just based on choosing answers based on feeling, but choosing your answers based on certainty, right? And certainty comes from you knowing the 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 foundations of English grammar, the building blocks of grammar, the 5 different components of a sentence, and knowing all of the characteristics that you need to know about those things extremely well. Okay, so that's just my pitch for you guys to really dive deep into, right, grammar. It gets really fun once you learn that. I've heard a lot of students tell me that, oh, they kind of enjoy answering writing questions because it's kind of like a game. And that's when you get to a really good place, right? Because when learning becomes enjoyable or fun, that's when you're learning the most or the best. Okay, and that's the place that I want to get each of you guys at, right? So in order for me to help you guys get there, I need your guys' help. Okay, so do me a couple of favors, you guys. First of all, the most important one is in the comment box, right? Always, after each video, always write down one thing that you learned. The reason some of you guys are like, why, right? Don't skip this, you guys, right? It's for your benefit, right? Remember, my goal isn't to get you guys to hate me. My goal isn't to get you guys to like me. My goal isn't to get you guys to do homework, right? That's not my goal. My goal is to help you guys miss fewer than 5 wrong consistently, period, right? And I know that everything that I do, everything that I tell you guys is driving you towards that. I have very specific reasons why I have you do the things that you do. If you ever want to know why, just please ask, because I know I'm trying to keep these videos short, but maybe every now and again, I should explain why. The reason I have you guys tell me what is one thing that you learned, right, is because you just watched a 20-minute video, me talking about a lot of different things, right? If you don't take time to process that, then all of the information that you're going to learn, like, is not organized, right? So this is where I say, hey guys, when you're watching my videos, don't try to learn everything. If you try to learn everything in my videos, you're going to remember nothing, right? So instead of trying to remember everything or learn everything, focus on one or two of the most important or meaningful things for you. Now, what's meaningful for Sarah might be different than what's meaningful for John, right? It just really depends on you. I want you guys to get really self-aware, right? Be honest with yourselves. Where are you having trouble with? What's helpful for you? And at the end of each video, right, I want you guys to review that, right? Reflect on what it is that we just talked about, and then choose one thing that was extremely meaningful for you, right? What is one thing that you learned? It could be one thing new that you didn't know before, or one thing that you knew kind of, sort of, but now you know even better. You have more confidence or certainty around that. And that's extremely important. And then you just articulating that, you just writing it, taking it from in your brain where you have a bunch of different ideas floating around, right? Out of your brain onto paper, onto the YouTube comment box so that you, not only you, but everyone else can read it, right? It says something. It means something. Right? It's you taking that extra step, right? To not only tell yourself like, hey, I'm committed to my education, right? But also it's an extra step that'll help you guys to remember this information even better. It'll help you to ingrain this even more because you're taking extra steps, right? To reinforce the knowledge. How? Because I'm having you guys remember what it is that we talked about. So I'm having you guys remember or think about, reflect on your experience, right? And then just choose one thing out of like the 50,000 things that I talked about, right? And then from there is not just think about it, not just have it in your head, but actually write it out. So you're doing like you're taking 3 extra steps to learn this stuff better. Right? And that's going to help extremely over time, right? So if you just keep doing that, right? One lesson at a time, one lesson at a time, one lesson at a time, guys, your knowledge is going to stack. And this is where I tell you guys, just trust the process, right? So that's one of the things that I want you guys to do. Okay, is what is one thing that you learned? And the second thing, you guys, is try to identify one area that you're having trouble with, right? And try to identify that specifically or precisely and write it in the comment box, okay? Because the way that I'm going to teach you guys is based off of the comments that you write to me, right? And I've already created a video, right, for a student who wanted help with punctuation. Right now, based off of that video, I can't read your guys' minds, right? I don't know exactly what you're thinking, so I'm just going to create a video. The video that I'll create is just like a video that I think might be useful, and then from there, you guys can watch it and then now comment on it again, right? Oh, I found this helpful, but I still am unsure about this, right? Or what about this, right? So each time you watch a video, it's going to trigger new thoughts, right? And those are thoughts that you don't want to just keep to yourself, right? You want to share them in the comment section, okay? Because I read all of those and I'll teach you guys that way. My goal is to teach 1 million students, right, online. That'll be incredible if I could do that, And so, you guys can get the ball rolling, right, by really communicating or interacting with me that way. When I say that I am your teacher, you guys, I mean it. I'm extremely committed to this. I just need you guys. I just need you guys to take that action, right, and just kind of trust in me. Just take the times to learn this stuff, learn about yourself, right? Take the times to self-study and then reach out for help, right? Because help is there. You can't rely on me 100%, right? Because I only see you guys every, for brief periods of time. So I trust that you guys are also like self-studying as well, right? You guys are also taking the practice tests on Blue Book. You guys are downloading College Board's free practice exams. You guys are working through other books, other courses, right? And that stuff is great. Maybe working with tutors. That stuff is excellent, right? I'll recommend that. But if you ever have a question that relates to like English grammar, especially, because that's what we're focused on right now, hey, feel free to ask, right? Never hurts to ask. As long as you're clear. You guys have heard somewhere in a good book, right, that says, ask and ye shall receive, right? It's just that you have to learn how to identify what it is that you really need help with, and then you have to know how to ask precisely, ask clearly, because the clearer you are with your request, right, the better I'll be able to help. Okay, give it a shot, you guys, and you'll be surprised, right, what types of videos come up next, right? Anyways, you guys, I enjoyed breaking down this question for y'all. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed kind of creating it for you. Until next time, you guys, yeah, just remember to always stay curious, right? Try to make learning fun in some way because it is enjoyable. You just have to find a way to make it enjoyable and just keep moving forward. Y'all got this. Take care.